Good afternoon. This is going to be the first of a 3-session adult ed, what we call it, Hillarybots, Trumpkins, and Bernie Bros. Oh my, the crazy election of 2016. We'll do one this Thursday and one next Thursday, and then a final session after the election to sort of unpack what's actually happened. Next week, we'll talk about the lay of the land in terms of votes and races, how the election contest looks like it's shaping up. Today, I'd really like to talk much more wide angle and broadly about what's going on, because we are looking at an unprecedented election cycle, and it's important to talk through that. I say to my students about once a day, it's not that you think that this election is wild and wacky, because every election is wild and wacky, and this is just the first one you're paying attention to. Like, I teach juniors and seniors who might think that every election plays out like this, and just they were too young to pay attention to the last one, so that's why they're noticing it now. And I keep saying to them, no, this is really not like anything else that we've seen before. Certainly that we've seen in my lifetime of paying attention to electoral politics, and possibly for a long time before that. I think you can make the case for the 1968 campaign, but that would be a little bit before my day. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're seeing and to try to understand this phenomenon. An enormous amount of what has gone on in this election season is people yelling at each other or yelling past each other. There hasn't really been a great deal of energy invested in the media that people consume at actually understanding what we're seeing. There are academics who are trying to do that now, and will spend years writing doctoral dissertations trying to do this after the election. But if you turn on CNN, you'll find somebody who's paid to spout Trump's line and somebody who's paid to spout Clinton's line, and they'll scream at each other, and there's not a lot of understanding what we're seeing going on. So we're going to spend some time trying to understand what we're seeing, and I will provide you with what I think is the conceptual framework that really explains what's going on in this election cycle, understanding that you are free to reject my interpretation and say, I think you're all wet. That's not what's going on, but I am going to provide you with the conceptual framing that I think really accounts for what we're seeing in this election cycle. So first, let's back up a minute and let's talk about the asymmetry here. Because if we look at the Democratic candidate, it's a funny thing to say about someone who's vying to be the first woman president of the United States in ever, but she actually, in every other way, is a very typical candidate. She has a long political resume, she has deep roots within the party, she has a standard list of accomplishments and experience that you might expect to see from somebody running for office. And so other than her gender, Hillary Clinton is actually a pretty standard issue presidential candidate. And it's not really a big surprise that she got the Democratic nomination. She, after all, was the person who finished second in the last contest, and it was a very, very close second. People sometimes forget that. She ended up a much closer second to Obama in 2008 than Sanders ended to her this year. It was a much closer primary contest. He really edged her by a nose, and so she just narrowly lost it last time. Kind of makes sense to have her be the nominee this time. And so there isn't a tremendous amount to try to understand in terms of the Hillary Clinton phenomenon. There is a great deal to try to understand in terms of the Trump phenomenon, and I'd like to talk about that at some length. But in order to first set that up, I'd like to talk about what Republican Party politics have looked like in the age of the modern Republican Party, which is to say basically since Ronald Reagan. The Republican Party since the Reagan era has stood on 3 legs. There have been 3 basic, right? So there have been 3 basic legs that held up the Republican Party. And those 3 basic legs that held up the Republican Party were conservative, traditional social values. That was the part of the Republican Party that attracted the newly mobilized and newly empowered, in the 60s and 70s, Christian right. A strong and assertive role for America on the international stage. That was the part of the Republican Party that repudiated earlier conservatives who had had a much more isolationist, let's stay home and mind our own business and stay out of other people's business and they can stay out of ours view. The Reagan-esque approach, which certainly then neoconservatives picked up and ran with, was the idea that the United States of America should be an assertive force in the international arena. So that it was the second of the three. And the third was a pro-business, small government, less regulation, anti-tax, economic conservatism. And so on those three legs, economic conservatism, social conservatism, and a strong foreign policy abroad in the world, stood the Republican Party, certainly since the Ronald Reagan years. And you would find people signing on to support the Republican Party who might have greater or lesser affinity for one of the legs than the other. So that, for example, you routinely found people who actually, because they were lower down on the socioeconomic pyramid, would have been more advantaged by the economic policies of the Democratic Party, nevertheless voting for the Republican Party because they were socially conservative, they were strongly pro-life, they were in favor of traditional family values, and like that. There actually was an entire book written about this by a political scientist named Thomas Frank, and the book is called What's the Matter with Kansas? He studies the state of Kansas, and he's trying to understand what in his view is wrong with Kansas. And what in his view is wrong with Kansas? That Kansas keeps voting Republican, even though the many less well-off people in Kansas would actually be more economically advantaged under a Democratic administration. And the answer is those people are actually making a principled choice to vote on moral grounds above their narrow financial interests, and they are voting for the pro-life party, the pro-traditional values party. Frank takes the argument one step further because he says, don't they notice the rug keeps getting yanked out from under them? Because then when the Republican Party gets into power, it doesn't actually enact those policies, it enacts the pro-business policies that its wealthy donors support. But whether or not you agree with Frank's thesis and what's the matter with Kansas, the striking thing of less well-off people voting for a Republican Party whose economic policies would be more beneficial for the more well-off, again, struck him enough to write a book about it. And that's because they were drawn by another leg of the Republican tripod, namely the conservative social values. Given that, the emergence of Donald Trump is very hard to understand. He has, at one time or another, explicitly repudiated, in part or in whole, all three of the legs of the usual Republican tripod. So when it comes to social values, there it's very interesting. The gatekeeper for the Republican nomination is you must say that you're pro-life, that you are against abortion. And so Donald Trump indeed now says that he is pro-life, although we have a very long history and record of him saying that he's pro-choice. He is, however, considerably more liberal on LGBT issues than is standard among Christian conservatives. And he's clearly not a Christian conservative. To the people, to the communities who are saying, you have to vote your values, that's not an argument that they're making right now. The argument they're making right now for those who follow these things, for the evangelicals and the religious Catholics who are supporting Donald Trump, their argument now is that God sometimes uses sinners to his purposes, and we're not voting for the Pope, we're voting for the president. So they've shifted that argument, given the reality that you simply cannot argue that you're voting for the person who has the better set of moral or religious values and voting for Donald Trump. So that's one day. In terms of America's role on the international scene, that is perhaps the place where he most vocally and consistently departs from Republican orthodoxy. Donald Trump has said many, many times that he thinks that the U.S. should pull back, play a less assertive role on the international scene. He has said it in terms of some of our security guarantees to alliance partners of ours, whether that's in NATO or in the Far East. I don't know. I'll explain briefly. If there's something that I'm saying that I'm assuming familiarity with that's not familiar to you, please raise your hand. The United States, since World War II, has had a number of different treaties with a number of different countries in which we guarantee their security and defense. And we do it in every case for reasons of what we think is in our own and the broader global self-interest. So for example, in the case of Japan, after Japan had been very aggressive and militaristic in the run-up to World War II, the United States essentially imposed on Japan after World War II a constitution that does not allow Japan to mount an army. Japan has a self-defense force, but it doesn't have a standard army. In exchange for forcing Japan to accept that constitution, in which it doesn't really have an army, the United States agreed to take on making sure that Japan would not be vulnerable to attack from its enemies. And so if you ever wonder why we have tens of thousands of American troops stationed in Japan, that's why. Particularly now that North Korea has nuclear weapons, and that's a general concern, having the United States there, keep in mind that part of the world, is part of a very long-standing 70-plus-year-old commitment that we have to Japan. In terms of NATO, the NATO alliance is an alliance between the United States. Originally, it was the countries of Northern and Western Europe, although it has expanded. That said, it was a mutual defense pact. And it said an attack against one of us will be seen as an attack against all of us. If you attack any NATO country, we will all go to war to defend the NATO country that was attacked. It was originally conceived as a protection against Soviet Union aggressive expansionism in Europe. The Soviet Union wouldn't try to attack a European country, knowing that the entire NATO mutual defense alliance would come to that country's defense. The only time that the mutual defense provisions of the NATO treaty have actually been invoked and used was?
Missile crisis.
No,
There's not an attack.
that's the wrong area.
The only time the provisions of the NATO treaty were actually used was after 9/11. That's why the NATO countries went to war in Iraq. I'm sorry, no, I totally misspoke. Afghanistan. The NATO countries did not all agree with the war in Iraq and didn't all go, but the NATO countries all went to war in Afghanistan, and that's why. Because the mutual defense provisions of the NATO treaty were invoked after 9/11. So it's interesting when we talk about the NATO treaty that has us willy-nilly defending other countries in the world who don't pull their weight. The only time anyone has actually gone to war under the provisions of the NATO treaty was after 9/11, and it was to protect the United States. Okay? So understand that all of these treaties have the United States playing a very broad role in the world. We are now guaranteeing the safety and freedom of countries all over Europe. We are guaranteeing the safety and freedom of Japan. We are making sure that South Korea feels that it's protected from North Korea, a different situation dating to the Korean War in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s. And Donald Trump, in various of the speeches that he has given, and this is a theme he returns to, says, they're not paying us enough. We can't afford to be protecting the whole world. If they don't pull their weight and pay what they should be paying, we shouldn't continue to make or honor these commitments. So that's the second leg. The third leg, the economic leg, is interesting because there's been some difference splitting. There are some places where Donald Trump has fallen in line with standard conservative economic orthodoxy, as in planning to cut government regulation and in planning to lower taxes, particularly to lower taxes on the wealthy as a way to stimulate the economy. Where he sharply departs from standard conservative economic orthodoxy is on trade. Standard conservative economic orthodoxy says the more trade that we have, with the fewer trade barriers, the more economic activity there is globally, the better it is for everyone. That is standard orthodoxy on trade for a very long time now. Not protectionism, not having high tariffs to keep foreign imports out, because they in turn will then raise tariffs and keep our exports out of their countries, and the economic pie will shrink for everyone, but everybody free economic exchange. And this has been built up again over many, many years and decades. So the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades that morphed into the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which is a global organization of countries, all of whom have no barriers to each other's trade. Right? This is the sort of the new economic order, if I can call it that, that's been created over the past decades, actually with a consensus of elite economists, Democrat and Republican, that broader trade is good for everybody. And Donald Trump says no, right? we have terrible deals, we're losing our shirts, our deals are negotiated by stupid people, we should be renegotiating the deals, cutting down trade, imposing tariffs. If U.S. companies want to move abroad, we should make it very difficult for them to do so, imposing tariffs on the goods that they want to then re-import to the United States, etc. Very much of a departure from conservative economic orthodoxy. And the other thing he says, it's very much of a departure from conservative economic orthodoxy, is that a big piece of conservative economic orthodoxy for a long time has been that the United States is on a financially unsustainable path. The commitments that we have made, the long-term commitments that we have made in terms of entitlements can't be sustained. We can't pay for them. Social Security and Medicare particularly are expensive and getting expensive-er, and we can't pay for that. And so at some point there will have to be benefit cuts, a reassessment, a shift to private investment accounts, something. This has been a part of the conservative economic conversation for a very long time. And strikingly, Donald Trump is having no truck with that. He says again and again, he's not cutting Social Security benefits, he's preserving Social Security. Entitlement reform is not in his vocabulary. So here we have a candidate who secured the Republican nomination for the presidency despite not being really there on any one of the three legs that I just told you constitute the modern Republican Party. Yes?
Well, it's also just to get back to trade for a second. He also is ahistorical because he likes to lay the blame for the current trade policies at the door of the Democrats, mostly Hillary Clinton herself. So, I mean, he also doesn't even acknowledge that that is a long-term conservative
Right.
policy.
So, but he has said explicitly, it is actually very interesting. Donald Trump has said explicitly when people accused him of not being conservative, he said, this isn't called the Conservative Party, it's called the Republican Party. He has no problem with disavowing long-held conservative positions. It is the Republican Party. He is now the senior figure within the Republican Party. He will define now what the Republican Party agenda is. And so casting up to him, this is not what conservatives have believed. That's not, again, he has said, this is not the Conservative Party, it is the Republican Party. And right now he's defining what the Republican Party means. So that's not the question. The question is the Republican primary voters who gave him the Republican Party nomination. So that's the what's going on here that I'd like to understand. That's the Trump phenomenon that I'd like us to try to understand and that I'd like to try to provide for you a kind of framing for thinking about. And there are really two views abroad in the land. We'll get to both of them. And we'll talk about the interplay between them. I'm going to do first the one that I want to spend less time on. Somebody many years ago once said to me in a different context, talking about an academic article we had both read, it's 90% right and it's 100% wrong. By which they meant it's identifying some really important things going on there, but the way it attributes everything to them misses the bigger picture. Okay? So the first argument is that the Trump phenomenon can solely be understood as a manifestation of a kind of white racism. Now, there is both the empirical support for this phenomenon. We are certainly familiar, certainly those of us who are active on Twitter are familiar with the ugliness that has been bubbling up from members of what's sometimes called the alt-right, who, among other things, are bringing open anti-Semitism back into the American conversation in a way that had not been in my lifetime. So there's that kind of support, like that seems to be something we're seeing. There's also, honestly, a kind of support, which is that people who are not Trump supporters can then feel really smug and superior. Because racism is like the worst thing to be in American society today. Them people are racist, I'm not racist, that's great, stick them in a box, and I don't have to think about them. The problem with that, aside from the fact I think it's not an adequate accounting for the phenomenon, is that it doesn't foster any kind of understanding of what we're seeing here, right? Stick a label on them, stick them in a box, I'm done, is not really a way of understanding the political phenomena we're seeing. So that one explanation, that what we're looking at is like white nationalism and racism, and that's what it is, and that's what we can call it, does not seem to me to really do the job. The other possibility that you hear often tossed about is economic anxiety. Is people who are finding themselves left behind, laid off, out of a job, the factory is closing, they don't have the kinds of skills that they would need to be competitive in 21st century jobs. They can't retool, they're 40, 50, 60 years old and laid off, what do I do with myself now? And it's coming from a basis of economic anxiety. While there certainly is evidence to suggest that there is a great deal of economic anxiety afoot in the land, there is a very simple problem with that as a premise for understanding the Trump phenomenon. And that is that if you look at the data, an important thing to do if we're going to be intellectually honest, if you look at the data, the poorest Americans are not supporting Donald Trump. The very poorest Americans are not where Trump's base of support is. Which first of all makes sense because many of the very poorest Americans are members of racial minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, and they tend not to be supporting Donald Trump. And that's also not where Donald Trump's base of support tends to be. It tends to be in the middle class. Now, that's not to say there can't be economic anxiety in the middle class, but we have to flesh out a little bit more what we're talking about, because we're not talking about the very, very poorest Americans who aren't getting by and who are wondering how they're going to get by. What is very compelling for me as an understanding of the phenomenon we're seeing, especially because it doesn't only account for the Trump phenomenon, it actually accounts reasonably well also for the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, which now has largely gone into quiescence. Democratic voters are more or less falling into line behind Hillary Clinton and worrying about the election in November and not spending so much time relitigating the Sanders-Clinton fights. But this actually does a really reasonable job of addressing the Bernie Sanders phenomenon as well, is a narrative that talks about a very specific kind of elite failure. And unlike the narrative that says they're all racist, stick them in a box, I can feel good about myself, this narrative actually causes us to do a lot more discomforting introspection, because all of us are members of the elite that in this narrative has failed. So I want to talk both about what the elite is and what the failure is to understand how I think we have come to be where we are. We're a considerable, both what the elite is and what the failure is. For a long time, the elite in American life was defined essentially by birth. Right? You were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were born into a certain social class, certain things were your entitlement by right. You didn't really apply to college, you just got accepted because in the course of my graduate research, I spent some time reading through files of people's college applications, graduate school applications, letters of recommendation for jobs as physicists, and you'd have this thing where like entire New England prep schools would just disgorge their graduating classes into either Harvard or Yale. And one young man decides he's going to Harvard, and then he goes off, of course, the summer after he graduates to Europe, to tour Europe for a couple of months, decides he doesn't want to go to Harvard, he wants to go to Yale, and sends a telegram back to Harvard that says, never mind, I'm going to Yale, and shows up the first day of school. Yeah. That's not the world that we know or are familiar with, right? We'll talk about that world in a minute. It's just taken for granted that there were certain class prerogatives, certain people, certain law firms, right? The so-called white shoe law firms didn't really employ Jews because Jews were not of that class. Certain investment banks didn't really employ Jews because Jews were not of that class. It was not easy for Jews to be employed as university professors in the elite universities or to get tenure. It was a very class-based system in which the hierarchy was well established, and white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men were running all of the institutions that mattered, and that was how the system worked. In the 1960s, really the post-World War II generation, we get a radical shakeup to that system, and it's a shakeup that says we are replacing that order with a meritocracy. The people who earn it can get in. It's a little hard to believe now when parents are paying I don't know how many $100s an hour to an SAT tutor, but the SAT, when it was started, was originally conceived of a way of offering merit-based access to elite colleges that otherwise would just go to the sons of Choate and Andover and whoever else was just going to waltz their way in. It was a way of giving less well-off but talented kids, many of them Jewish, but of other ethnic and religious backgrounds as well, access to the halls of power. The idea of breaking the lock that members of certain class groups, ethnic and class groups had on access to the elite and opening it up to anybody who earned it was to turn over life in the United States in that way. And it worked at first. It did work. There were a lot of people who got access to those schools and ultimately to those positions. We don't have to sit here and go through all of it, but it is striking that right now there is not one Protestant sitting on the United States Supreme Court. They are all Jewish or Catholic. It is also striking that they are all graduates of Harvard or Yale Law School, except for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who went to Harvard for 2 years, and then when her husband graduated and transferred to New York, she finished up in Columbia, and so she has a Columbia JD. That's your Supreme Court. So and that, I think, encapsulates exactly what we're talking about. The lock of ethnic background, of the sort of chummy old boys network is broken, replaced by an idea of meritocracy that a Sonia Sotomayor from the Bronx and a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a Jewish girl, and Clarence Thomas, who's Catholic, Antonin Scalia was also Catholic, can end up on the United States Supreme Court, and here we are. Okay? What has happened over the past few decades, though, is that meritocracy, of which we are all the beneficiaries because we have all made out good in it, and our kids make out good in it, has become much more rigid and less permeable, and therefore one's going to have to say less meritocratic. We don't like to think about that because we like to think that if we made it to the top, we earned our way to the top. But we all know, having been the teachers or parents or grandparents of kids going through the college application process, that it is not, in fact, solely an assessment of students' merit, right? If you have the resources to get all of the different kinds of coaches and supports and aides and massagers to help your application, to help your test prep, and to help your this and to help your that, you will present a very different college application than a student walking in from a disadvantaged public school in New York City who, even if they have the innate talent, may simply not be told, you really need to study and prep and take the SATs 3 times because you could do score choice and this whole thing, and it's like, well, great, and use your highest score. So they take it once and they get what they get, and there we are. Okay? There is a great deal of evidence. This is not a belly button judgment. There's a great deal of evidence to say that the elite colleges, unsurprisingly, today, extremely overrepresent the highest income quartile in American life and extremely underrepresent the lowest income quartile. That is the case. So the diversity that your child is going to encounter if she goes to Barnard or Brandeis or wherever she goes is going to be the diversity of, the doctor's kid from Scarsdale, the doctor's kid from Newton, Massachusetts, and the doctor's kid from Hancock Park, which is a certain kind of diversity, but it's not the diversity of meeting kids who grew up rural, poor, on farms, urban, poor. That's not really going to be the diversity your kid is likely to encounter in an elite university. Again, that's not me, that's not my belly button. We have the data on that very, very clearly. People increasingly, we see marriage is sorted. Again, sort of very intuitive and easy to understand. If you're meeting your marriage partner either in college or at the place you work, so we might like novels or movies about the billionaire who falls in love with the maid, but in real life that's not what happens. In real life, the billionaire marries the billionaire or the billionaire's daughter, and increasingly in America today, it's a different conversation. People of lower socioeconomic status don't get married as much. It's very interesting that marriage is something in America today that happens much more in higher socioeconomic strata. Different conversation, not for right now. We see it in the distribution of income. In the generation after World War II, for a variety of reasons, the income distribution was much more collapsed. That means the richest Americans were a lot less rich than the average American. The gap between average and richest was much less in 1960 than it is today. So it's not just a sense that, oh, I kind of have the sense that we all lived together and we didn't know so much who was rich and who was not rich. That actually was how it was. There was much less distinction. You might have had somebody who had a bigger house. You were much less likely to have somebody who had 5 houses and a private jet. And that's because, again, we have data on this. Socioeconomic distribution has gotten much more unequal over the past 40 years. And so where we see a system that works, or perhaps we're anxious about it because we're anxious to see that it continue working for our children the way it worked for us. So we worry about college because we want to make sure our kids get their foot on the ladder in the right place to keep climbing the way we were able to. There is a great chunk of America that we do not often spend a lot of time with that doesn't see that the system works the same way. They went to college, they didn't get didn't have access to the job that paid the same amount. They went to law school, they didn't get a job with a fancy New York law firm, they had a hard time finding a job that would actually pay off their enormous law school loans. They started college, had to drop out in the middle for whatever family reason, and now have significant student debt and not a degree. It's interesting, the people who are most likely to default in college debt are not the people with 6-figure college debt. Because if you have 6-figure education debt, I shouldn't say college, education, college and graduate school. If you have 6-figure education debt, you're probably a doctor or a lawyer and you'll figure it out. The people who are most in trouble are the people who have $20,000, $30,000 in debt, but either they didn't finish college with a degree or their place on the socioeconomic spectrum is such that for them carrying that $20,000 or $30,000 in debt is more difficult than it is for the newly minted doctor with 6 figures in educational debt. And so a system that we see from our vantage point as fundamentally working, there are many Americans who say, right now, it's not working for me. And there are a couple of phenomena in the past decade and a half that have exacerbated that and contributed to that in an even more intense way. I'm going to work backwards, because the more recent one is the financial crisis. We remember the financial crisis, the meltdown 07-08, and the sort of panic and hysteria that everybody felt, what's going to happen and what's going to crumble and collapse. There certainly were people who lost their jobs. There certainly was a lot of anxiety and fear around that. And then the federal government bailed out the big banks. They didn't collapse. They didn't fold. People who were employed in senior levels in those banks still kept their jobs. Everything seemed to stabilize and recover. Unless you were affected by it, it's easy to remember that millions of Americans lost their home to mortgage foreclosures. And there are long stories to be told here. David Dayen just published a book called Chain of Title, which is about how 3 enterprising Floridian citizens, none of them lawyers or scholars or anything else, all of them people just caught up in the mortgage foreclosure crisis by their own very careful investigating of what was being done to them, discovered the enormous amounts of fraud that was going on in the foreclosure process, in which in the very complicated creation of financial instruments out of home mortgages, which in fact was part of what contributed to the economic collapse in the first place. It wasn't actually clear at the end of the day who owned the mortgages on these homes when these people couldn't pay their mortgages anymore. And so there were banks who were foreclosing on the homes that they did not legally have title to, which means they were stealing people's houses, is what was going on. They were stealing people's homes. The reason why you didn't hear big news about bank CEOs going to jail is because they didn't, right? The whole Wells Fargo thing that we're watching unfold now, where Wells Fargo put a lot of pressure on its salespeople to open up new additional accounts for Wells Fargo customers, so that they would continue experiencing growth, more accounts and more accounts. And so under pressure, these salespeople eventually just started opening up accounts for customers without the customer's consent. And you would have people who were having accounts open from they didn't know anything about, and then they were being charged fees because they weren't putting money in the account they didn't know they had because they didn't open it. And then their credit rating was being affected because they were delinquent. So, and the guy who was the head of Wells Fargo was collecting 9-figure payouts while this was going on, and the woman who was running this division was collecting 8-figure payouts while this was going on. And they've now been hauled before Congress a couple of times. It's the one thing in this election season that Republicans and Democrats have seemed to agree about, that they hate Wells Fargo, and the Republicans and Democrats on the committee, on the Senate Financial Services Committee, smacked them around a little bit, and finally the CEO of Wells Fargo stepped down. But there are many Americans who look at that and say, you know what? The system is rigged. The people at the top, somehow, no matter what, they collapse the economy, they steal my home, they fraudulently open bank accounts for me, and I don't know, they're still living in their 6 houses and their private jet, and here I am, I got foreclosed on, I'm 40 years old and back in my mother's basement, I'm 40 years old and living with a relative, I'm trying to scrape together the rent, I'm doing all the things I'm doing. Somehow you tell me it's a meritocracy. You work hard, you get ahead. The system is fair. It works. I don't see that in my life. I know you see that in your life because you went to Columbia and you're a lawyer and now you're hiring an SAT tutor for your kids. So you see that in your life, but I don't see that in my life. And that sense that systems have failed them, that systems that they were promised would reward hard work and investment have failed them, that somehow the people at the top seem to keep accumulating more and it's going hunky-dory and they are stuck in place spinning their wheels if they're lucky, and if they're not lucky they're slipping back, is a very powerful motivating force that I do not think, by definition, the people who are writing the stories and reporting the stories and the politicians and the academics, by definition, we are generally not part of that part of American society. And we don't necessarily see it and know it. And this phenomenon that we are seeing, again, it's a Trump phenomenon, but in considerable measure as well, it is also the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, is a whomp upside the head from a whole chunk of America who is saying, you promised us a meritocratic system and we don't see it working that way for us. So a very interesting book that does not describe this election but does describe this phenomenon is a book called Twilight of the Elites by Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes is an MSNBC commentator, and he is by political leaning liberal, but I don't think that his description of this phenomenon is at all limited to people who subscribe to his electoral politics, because he traces this development of this new meritocratic elite over the decades, and then the kind of collapse and failure of this elite. Oh, I didn't go back to do the second example, because the second example, moving back historically, right? The first example is the financial crisis of 07-08. The second example is the Iraq War. The elites pushed and sold the Iraq War, and the elites bought the Iraq War, right? Hillary Clinton in the Senate voted to go to war in Iraq. George W. Bush and his circle of advisors said this is a grand old thing to do and we should do it. It is true the administration in the White House was Republican, but there were many, many Democrats who signed on as well and who said, yes, we think this is a good thing to do. I am not going to be telling you anything you don't know when I tell you those people's kids are very unlikely to be the people who were fighting the Iraq War. And in fact, during the Iraq War was the first time in American history that during a war we actually had a tax cut rather than a tax increase to pay for the war. So you could be, sitting at your keyboard punditing away. You could be Thomas Friedman. Again, I want to make clear this elite thing is not a right-left thing. Thomas Friedman is a foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, generally thought of as being in the center-left. Thomas Friedman was a cheerleader for the Iraq War long after many people had seen that it had gone very south, and he would keep saying again and again, It's going to take 6 more months to see how this is going to work. It's going to take 6 more months, to the extent that 6 more months became a joke. It was called the Friedman unit. Friedman unit is 6 months. And it's like, how many more Friedman units until we know that this is not actually turning out the way we want? If you look it up, Friedman unit, I don't know if it still does. For a while, Friedman unit had its own Wikipedia page. A Friedman unit is 6 more months that people were making fun of Thomas Friedman, keeping on saying, we can't really tell if it's... Thomas Friedman is a very, very wealthy man, not just from his book sales and everything else. He married an heiress. Thomas Friedman is a very wealthy man, living in a nice house in a suburb of Washington, D.C. His kids are not in the U.S. military. They're not facing the consequences. He can keep saying another 6 months, another Friedman unit. Let's see how it's turning out. There are a lot of Americans who are saying, so all y'all in Washington were gung-ho on this war. All y'all in Washington thought it was a great idea. My kid's over there. Let's say my kid's not dead. Let's say my kid has just served 5 tours of duty, going back and going back and going back with all the toll it takes on my kids. And now at some point, 6, 7 years later, you're like, yeah, whoopsie, whatever. Guess we made the wrong call on that. So elite failure, lack of trust in the elites, lack of a sense that these people who are supposed to know what they're doing and supposed to be telling us, the right way, the right thing to do, actually know what they're doing or can tell us the right thing to do. So you know what? They're telling us we can't have tariffs, we can't have protectionism, we can't limit free trade. They're telling us we can't nominate Donald Trump because he's not the right kind of Republican. They're telling us you can't vote for a 74-year-old socialist senator from Vermont with crazy hair and a Brooklyn accent to be a nominee for president of the United States. We're actually not buying what you people are selling because you've been selling a lot of stuff to us for a long time. And we don't see that it's working for us the way it's been promised that it's going to work for us. And the striking thing about it is that sentiment is much more likely to be found in the middle class than in the people who are the worst off. And this is because of a phenomenon scholars refer to as the revolution of rising expectations. Right? The French Revolution actually doesn't come when things are the worst they could have possibly been. It's actually after there's a bourgeoisie and things start getting better and people start becoming middle class. And then they're like, hey, wait a second, why do we have to live like this under a king with no political vote, right? You all understand the concept of the revolution of rising expectations. As I start to expect a little bit more, then it's hard to settle for less. And that's when I find myself. It makes much more sense that somebody who's in the middle class, whose father was in the middle class, and who thinks somehow that their middle class status is tenuous or threatened, whether because they've lost their home to foreclosure, or they haven't, but they know a lot of people who have, or because they always feel like they're one medical crisis, one bill, one expensive car repair away from, there's a metric that economists sometimes use to measure people's economic tenuousness. And it's if you needed to get $400 for something, would you be able to? An unexpected car expense, an unexpected medical expense, would you have access to $400? It is striking. I think to us it's like almost hard to imagine. Not only because we are, in the better off echelons of American life, but because we are so tied into a web of community. $400, if I needed $10,000 tomorrow to save my kid's life, medical treatment, disaster, I need $10,000 tomorrow. If I had it, I would have it, and if I didn't have it, I would have family members I'd go to, and if I didn't have family members to go to, I would have gamachs, I would have shuls, I would have people I know. I would have an entire community that I could turn to say, I need $10,000 cash tomorrow to save my kid's life. And I would have. So if you live in a world and in America in which there are millions and millions and tens of millions of Americans who say, I couldn't get $400 tomorrow if I needed it, I don't think we understand. I'm mixing categories a little bit because we think of those people as being the poorest of the poor. There was a very interesting article written for the New York Times a few years ago by somebody who said, no, that's me. And I lived in a house in the suburbs, and you think that person who can't get $400 is, in a homeless shelter in New York City? No, that was me in a house in the suburbs, but so tight and pinched and every penny accounted for that if something went out on the car, I was going to be the whole thing was so tenuous, was so precarious, was so just balanced. And again, I actually think this is a whole other conversation for a different time, but I think we see a little bit of that tenuousness and precariousness. This is my own take, you could take it or leave it. I think some of the anxiety we see around college in our community is people's sense of precariousness within their own lives and their own kids. And if I only get my kid into the right college, I'll be certain that they will then make it and be okay and have a good life. I don't know if it's good or bad to tell you the data doesn't bear that out. The data bears out that the best prediction of your socioeconomic status in life is your parents' socioeconomic status. So your kids are probably going to be okay anyway. You're not as, but I think we see a little bit of the precariousness and that anxiety. I think that anxiety around college, to me, I think is partially a manifestation that I want my kids to be okay. But we don't begin to understand what that precariousness looks like for the many, many Americans for whom it really is a great deal more precarious, right? We all know this. Medical bills are the greatest sort. You think of bankruptcy as being like, I go to the casino and I gamble so I go bankrupt, or I buy really expensive shoes that I can't afford so I go bankrupt. That's why I would go bankrupt, but that's not why most Americans go bankrupt. The greatest cause of American bankruptcy is medical debt. I had a medical expense, enormous whatever it is. I don't think we quite get that precariousness, and along with the precariousness is a sense that the system doesn't work the way I was promised it would work. We think the meritocracy is doing hunky-dory because it's working largely for us. It is working for our community. It is working for people. And I don't think we understand the extent to which people have a sense that it's not working. Where I want to go now is to bring race and ethnicity back into this conversation. Because they don't have no place in this conversation, but I think using them as the sole explanations for the phenomena we are seeing, as I said to you, it could be 90% right and it's 100% wrong. It is a way oversimplification. I think it allows for distancing and self-satisfaction and not trying to understand. I also think it's wrong, meaning it's not just that I think morally or ethically it's not the right thing to do. I happen to think it doesn't give you insight because I think it's not correct. There have been 2 books that came out this year talking about these sort of precariously living white people in America that people think of as the Trump population. One is a book called Hillbilly Elegy. And Hillbilly Elegy is written by a man who was raised in one of these poor communities. There's actually a third book, I'll tell you about in a minute. Was raised in one of these very, very, very poor white communities who actually made it out. He ended up becoming an army officer, getting an elite education, and so he speaks both languages. He travels between 2 worlds. And he writes this book about the community and the world in which it was raised and how it sees the world and how he thinks. I'll just tell you that there's a book that I'm not going to refer to that's the most academic of the 3, and that's a book by a historian named Nancy Eisenberg with an I, called White Trash, in which she studies over centuries the phenomenon in American history, all the way from the beginning up until now, of the phenomenon of low-class, economically disadvantaged white people. But there's a sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. Arlie Hochschild is famous for a book that she wrote in the late 80s called The Second Shift, in which she wrote about women and housework and women trying to navigate the new feminist reality. They could go out and have jobs, but they were still carrying most of the responsibilities at home. It's worth going back to read The Second Shift. Even if it was written in 1989, it holds up really, really well, but that's a different story. But she wrote a more recent book in which she spent a lot of time among white people in Louisiana, talking to them about their realities and their lives. And it's like, what's the matter with Kansas writ large? Here are people who are suffering terrible poisoning because chemical companies have dumped all kinds of toxic chemicals in their backyards, and yet they're supporting the Republican Party that would want to pull back on environmental regulations rather than calling for more environmental regulations. So you can either say, as some people do, they're dumb, they're just all dumb. But again, I think that's both, morally problematic and also, as it happens, wrong. Or you can say, let me understand how you experience your own life and why you are making choices that to me seem so irrational. And so she talks to these people. How do you experience and understand your own life, right? What's the matter with Kansas, except in this case, Kansas is Louisiana. And they say to her, here's how we see our life. We're standing in line. We're waiting our turn. We're doing what you told us to do. We're working hard. We're putting our... And we're not getting anywhere. The line's not moving. We don't get ahead. We don't... And people keep cutting the line. People keep cutting the line. We see members of racial and ethnic minorities cutting the line. We see recent immigrants cutting the line. They're somehow getting ahead of us. They're getting benefits. They're getting government assistance. They're getting... This is not an empirical statement as to whether that is true or not. It is a statement of their experience, how they understand the world. I don't even mean experiences necessarily happen to them. how they understand the world. Their experiences, they're not getting ahead, and they are hearing that there are these amazing untapped, reserves of government largesse, or except they are being tapped, they're just being tapped by other people, not them. And they somehow are suffering all the things they're suffering and can't quite ever get any place, while they know, or they think they know, that other people are getting what's not coming to them, are cutting the line, are getting ahead of them, are getting ahead, or other people are manipulating the system, that we become those other people, right? The Jews are manipulating the system to somehow something or other. Again, you don't have to grant that narrative is factually correct in order to understand that it is enormously powerful in terms of how these people see and experience their own lives. It explains how they relate to the elite institutions around them. They see the elite institutions around them as having failed them. They're doing what they're supposed to do, getting nowhere and getting nothing. Somehow other people are being allowed to game the system, get ahead, cut in front of them, whatever it is. So that becomes a very powerful force then in how they vote, and how they relate to institutions, whether those institutions are the media, right? Whether those institutions are Congress. I mean, the only one who has lower approval ratings when they poll than the media is Congress, whose approval ratings at this point are routinely in single digits. And indeed, both the entire notion of meritocracy and perhaps even the entire notion of democracy, if they don't really believe that it works the way it's promised to work. The Saturday Night Live sketches this election have been famous, but I don't want to talk about those fake debates, right? So you have somebody mimicking in exaggerated fashion Hillary Clinton, and somebody else mimicking in exaggerated fashion Donald Trump, and you could find it or funny or not funny. I don't want to talk about it. There was a sketch on last week's Saturday Night Live called Black Jeopardy that was much more on point, exactly talking about this. Tom Hanks as some Make America Great Again cap wearing, bestubbled trucker shows up on Black Jeopardy, and they find out that there's a great deal they have in common. They both don't trust the government. They both think the election is rigged. They're both living lives of financial precarity. It's all good until the very end, when the final Jeopardy question turns out to be a question about which lives matter, and they realize that this is going to be the question that divides them. But that is precisely the phenomenon that we are seeing now. We are seeing a great deal of distrust of elites and institutions on both sides of the aisle, but where early Hochschild Louisianans experience, or again, I don't want to say experience in the sense that it happens to them, but understand the world, apprehend the world, that members of racial and ethnic minorities, that immigrants are cutting ahead of the line, getting somehow the better government benefits that they're not getting, and therefore racial and ethnic tensions and divisions become heightened, but heightened because of and through and with this sense that elites are failing, that institutions are failing, that the promise of meritocracy has not been kept. It's at that point that African Americans, that Hispanics say, yeah, we were with you when we thought that the iPhone was just stealing your fingerprints and giving them to the government, and we were with you when we thought the election was rigged, but we really are not going to be with you when the discussion turns to these direct issues of race. And so I think that if we are understanding the phenomenon that we are seeing in this election, and it genuinely is a foundation-shaking election, I don't know what happens after this. Historians are very bad at predicting the future. We shouldn't try. I don't know what happens after this. I don't know if the Republican Party tries to say, well, Trump was a one-off and it was an exception, and we're going to go back to our tripod, and we're going to go back to talking about a strong American presence in the world and free trade. I don't know whether the Republican elites try that, and I don't know whether the Republican voters will swallow that, even if the Republican elites try that. Right now it is clear that the Republican voters are lined up behind Donald Trump, not behind Paul Ryan. We have survey data on that. When they're asked whose values do you more agree with, many more of them say Donald Trump than Paul Ryan. So that's very clear right now. What happens after this, I don't know, but there is really a deep critique, self-criticism, examination, soul-searching as to whom the United States is working for right now and to whom it's not working for, that is worth thinking about on both sides, right and left. And it doesn't happen if we just say, oh, those voters are ignorant, or those voters are racist, or whatever it is, and we don't ask the really important questions of, are there systems or structures here that we think are working great, but they may not be working well for all people, which is leading to this revolt, both the Trump revolt against the elites on its side and the Sanders revolt against the elites on its side. I will stop now and take a few minutes for questions, comments, thoughts, or anything else. None. Yes.
Are you discussing this with the kids?
So I teach AP Government, and I discuss this with my students all the time. My entire course right now the kids are like, if you talk to us about the elites one more time, we're going to roll our eyes out of our heads. But my entire course has been framed around elite failure and thinking about this election as a manifestation of elite failure.
But I mean, school-wide, is there any sort of discussions about the phenomenon of this election?
There is discussion about the election, but I think at a much more, here's the Electoral College, how it works, here's what's going on kind of level. This is a conversation that we haven't had here, but the side benefit of keeping the conversation at the level of the elite failure is that we don't get into at each other's throats about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We as an educational institution have a complicated mission to educate our kids, to create an environment in which every kid feels safe articulating their points of view and not like they're going to get their head taken off for them. Those two things don't always feel like they work so easily together, and it's been a sort of delicate thing to navigate.
I guess I asked the question only because it's such an interesting idea that you're bringing up that I feel like unless we start raising the awareness of, to a certain extent, our generation.
Right. So in my AP Government class, this is like, well, elite failure is the name of the game, and I told you my students like, oh no, are you doing elite failure again today? But everything really gets apprehended. Meaning the conversation, I'm not gonna go into this. But the conversation about superdelegates on the Democratic side, with the Bernie people saying the superdelegates it's again a conversation about elites and elite failure. Should the elites of the Democratic Party get to tell us who the nominee is? Do the people get to decide? And so this has bubbled up every which where this election cycle. This question of elites and elite failures. Yes.
Once they decide that the elite people have failed them, do they talk about how to correct this? What program will they put into place? How will they correct this problem?
So that is a very interesting and also complicated question, because I think there's a simplistic answer which says, if we hand out the right goodies, then we'll solve the problem. And that is complicated because once people have a certain frame that they're committed to, it's sometimes hard to dismantle that frame. I'll give you two very quick examples. One in the other direction is people hate Congress, they loathe Congress, they despise Congress, 9% of them trust Congress, 90-some-odd% of congressmen get reelected every 2 years. So people have no trouble saying, I detest Congress as an institution, my congresswoman is an okay gal, I'll vote for her again. It doesn't disrupt their framing. They never say, well, then maybe Congress is not as bad. Congress is horrible. My congresswoman is an okay woman. And then we see that. We see both things consistently for a while now. The rate of reelection of incumbents is sky high, and the approval rating of Congress is like through the floor.
Well, he's going to change. They say that he says he's going to throw out all of government.
Right. Well, he's talking about Trump. But the other example is during the fight about Obamacare. So that was a very big fight about whether we should, in fact, create a new government program to provide health insurance to people who didn't have it. And there were many people who were very upset about it and protested against it. And like the most famous protest sign from the whole anti-Obamacare protest was somebody holding up a sign because one of the ways they were going to pay for a broader health coverage for the whole society was to cut back in certain ways on Medicare. Okay, Medicare is government-provided health care for people over 65. Cut back on that a little bit to have a little bit more money to shift to the rest of the age range. And there was somebody at some protest holding up a very famous sign saying, keep government hands off of my Medicare. Now the reason that's funny is because Medicare is a government
agency
program provided by the federal government, paid for by taxes. It's not like the government's taking something away from you. The government is reallocating resources in something it gives you already. But what that suggests is that the framing Medicare is mine and the big, mean, nasty federal government is trying to take it away from me is more powerful than the actual Medicare is something the federal government gave you, and maybe it's going to decide to give you a little less so some 30-year-old could have insurance. So that all is one issue. That breaking through that is very challenging and very difficult. Something else that comes into play here is the extent to which there are very few, if any, agreed upon facts anymore. It becomes very hard to break through when I can't say, well, but this, what you're saying isn't true and this is true. Oh, you say it's true. Because on your Facebook feed, they say it's true. But on my Facebook feed, they say something different. To the extent that news, facts, information, all comes filtered through a partisan lens. Your polls say this, well, my polls say that. There's no shared understanding of actually
What's true?
what is. So that becomes the very, I'm going to say to you, it is Donald Trump says often in his stump speeches that illegal immigrants get better benefits than our veterans. Okay, that's not true in any conceivable stretch of the imagination. So I'm going to go to say that's not actually true. Illegal immigrants don't get better benefits than our veterans. That's not going to be a compelling argument, right? And so there are many things I think that make this very difficult. Do I think the problem is intractable? People start with like, we've never been this divided in American life. And I'm like, I don't know if you heard this thing called Civil War, 800,000 people died. It's like when Jews start with, the Jewish people has never been such a mess. I'm like, the Jewish people have been such a mess for the last however many thousand years and we're still here. So it's not that I'm despondent and throwing up my hands, but I actually think it's a pretty big problem. And if we don't figure out how to sort of get our arms around this in some way, it's a pretty big problem. Yeah, last question.
I believe there is some historical support for the thesis that revolutions are not made by people at the bottom, but they're made more by people at the bottom who started to get their way up, but not quick enough or down.
Right. So that's the idea of the revolution of rising expectations, that as they expect more, it becomes frustrating, they don't get it. And here we're dealing with something slightly different, which is people who are in the middle but worried about slipping back. And that's a little bit of an interesting twist. Thank you very much. Next week we'll look a little bit more about breaking down what's actually going on the ground and trying to understand it. I'm sorry?